Exactly 8 years and a day removed from LeBron James' The Decision, last night we got the presidential version in Donald Trump's primetime announcement of his second Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, a man Trump characterized as a judge's judge. He's a 53-year-old former aide to George W. Bush, who served on the D.C. Circuit Court since 2006. He also worked with Ken Starr on the investigation that led to Bill Clinton's impeachment. But while some liberals say Kavanaugh is too extreme, most conservatives seem pretty content. The president thinks everybody's happy.
Brett Kavanaugh has gotten rave reviews, actually from both sides. And I think it's going to be a beautiful thing to watch over the next month, but he has gotten rave reviews.
Joining me with their reviews are Renee Landers, Suffolk Law Professor and constitutional law expert. Renee, nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Kevin Martin's a partner at Goodwin Procter, who in a past life clerked for Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. It's good to see you,
good
too,
to see
Kevin.
you too, Jim.
So, Kevin, starting with you, unlike Neil Gorsuch replacing your former boss, Antonin Scalia, and almost always conservative replacing an almost always conservative, the stakes are obviously higher here because you have a conservative Kennedy being a guy who obviously voted with liberals, everybody knows now, on things like affirmative action and gay rights and abortion. So is there any evidence of a similar, I don't know what to call it, ideological or judicial diversity in Kavanaugh's extensive legal resume?
You know, it's hard to say because he was a judge on the D.C. Circuit. The D.C. Circuit mainly deals with administrative law issues, and so it doesn't have the sort of, in most cases, hot-button topics like abortion coming before it. Every now and then they do. There was the case last year involving the illegal immigrant who wanted to get an abortion, which came before the court, and so he dealt with it in that circumstance. But he was never examining state laws, for example, on abortion the way that judges in some other circuits.
Do you agree with Kevin there that we don't have that kind of evidence of his willingness to, for lack of a better expression, cross the aisle?
We don't so much. You know, he has good relationships. He has a reputation for having good relationships with people across the aisle in Washington, but we don't have a lot of evidence of that. On some issues, though, like on gun rights, he has written about that, and he has a very strong view of a robust Second Amendment right.
Where the court was on Heller, for example, on the critical D.C. case.
Right.
But I want to get back to the case Kevin mentioned a minute ago. He didn't address in that decision about that undocumented immigrant who wanted an abortion. He was in the dissent. Didn't address a larger constitutional issue. But despite that, a lot of people who are pro-choice are concerned. But while you aren't allaying their concern, my understanding from having spoken to you is you don't think that this court, even with a Kavanaugh on it, is going to outright repeal 1973's Roe v. Wade, but rather chip away on the margins.
I think that that's the approach that they will take, and they certainly won't outright repeal Roe v. Wade immediately. I think
Jeffrey Toobin thinks they will. Jeffrey Toobin from CNN says in 18 months, 20 states will have banned abortion.
Well,
which they can only do if Roe v. Wade. I mean, they can only effectively do if Roe v. Wade is
But many of the states have adopted laws sort of restricting abortions after 20 weeks, all these kinds of things. And I think there will be a period of time where those laws might be upheld, those restrictions. But I think that the outright ban might come at some point later, if at all.
Here's another thesis. As an outsider, you were inside. I've never been. One case I was sort of part of a team arguing, but they say that politics aren't involved. I say, to the contrary, 5 men, and that's what it would take, 5 men are not going to repeal a woman's right to choose after 45 years in the books.
Yeah,
that's a fair statement, isn't it?
I think 5 men, 3 men and 2 women, it's not going to be repealed. I mean, at this point, that decision is older than I am, frankly. And I think if you look at somebody like Chief Justice Roberts or Kavanaugh, they're not going to get rid of it.
Why do you say that?
Because look at what Chief Justice Roberts did with the Affordable Care Act decision, right? He is not someone who's going to rock the boat on something which is so political.
So you think he might, even if Kavanaugh was willing to repeal it with 3 other conservative justices, you think the Chief Justice might not let it happen?
I would be shocked if he allowed it to. And also, as Renee was saying, why, right? Laws will come before the court.
Because the guy who appointed him and Gorsuch promised the American people repeatedly, including in a final debate, I will pick justices who are pro-life who will, quote, automatically repeal Roe v. Wade. That isn't a good enough reason?
So one of the questions that the senators might ask Judge Kavanaugh is whether he had a conversation with the president about being loyal to the president's sort of policy
Think he's going to
initiatives.
answer that question?
I don't know. It would be interesting to see.
Speaking of the Senate, can we play one senator who a lot of pro-choice people who are more concerned than you two are about Roe v. Wade are hanging their hat on is a vote from a moderate Republican from Maine. Here's Susan Collins. Here's what she said on CNN.
I would not support a nominee who demonstrated hostility to Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, the Globe in a good piece this morning points out that she has voted for every Trump nominee. She even voted for this guy, John Kenneth Bush, for an appellate position, who had said the two greatest tragedies in America are slavery and abortion, comparing Dred Scott to the decision to abortion. But there's no, in Kavanaugh's, getting back to your original point, Kevin, there's no evidence that Kavanaugh will demonstrate a, quote, hostility to Roe v. Wade that he hasn't demonstrated in his judicial career in a hearing, right?
No, I mean, look, besides the fact that he's a Republican appointed judge and that he's Catholic, no one can point to anything in his background that would suggest that he has a hostility to Roe versus Wade. He came up in Washington, D.C. He's part of the D.C. establishment. And I'd be very surprised if someone with that background would do something that would rock the boat so much.
Can we move to quickly?
Yeah, just very quickly. When he was at his confirmation hearing for the D.C. Circuit, he was asked these questions, and he there, said that Roe v. Wade was settled law. It had been upheld many times by the court in its essential character. But that's a different job than being on the Supreme Court because he's required to follow precedent on the D.C. Circuit.
Can we go to another issue?
Sure.
He wrote. We talked about this on the radio today. He wrote a law review piece in 2009 saying presidents shouldn't be indicted, a distraction, that kind of thing. Some are making a leap, and I want to know if you think it's appropriate to say, well, that means that he also doesn't think a president can be subpoenaed, can't be called before a grand jury, and might even mean that a president can pardon himself, all mostly unresolved issues that may arise in the context of the Mueller thing. Is that too much of a leap, do you think?
I think that's probably too much of a stretch. And, he was writing a law review article there, and it's hard to know what he would do when when the issue might come up in the context of a very specific set of facts.
Do you think it's too hard to know, too?
As Renee was saying, that was one of several issues addressed in a law review article that was basically on the broader subject of the separation of powers, that very exciting subject. And I think if you look at what he was saying, based on his own experience with the Ken Starr investigation and working for the Bush White House, he thought having a president be subject to a criminal proceeding while in the White House would be too much of a distraction, but said you can always impeach the president if you have a president in office who's engaged in criminal activity. So he's not someone who's in favor of the unchecked right of a president to run amok and commit crimes. That's too much.
Very quickly before we go, we also discussed this today. While there was a lot of frustration that Neil Gorsuch would not answer questions about specific cases, John Roberts did answer some questions. You mentioned Justice Ginsburg did at her hearing years ago. Where do you think we end up here with nominee Kavanaugh?
Every decade the process gets more and more combative, and I think we're at a stage now where everyone knows any answer they give will be turned into snippets on YouTube and taken out of context. And I think going forward, every nominee will be reluctant to provide anything that might be fodder for the other side.
Can the Democrats pierce that veil quickly?
They might be able to because, as I said earlier, he did answer some of those questions when he was nominated for the D.C. Circuit.
That was then, this is now.
This is now,
Renee,
yes.
it's nice to see you.
Oh, it's good to see you,
Kevin,
Jim.
thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I really do.